Barbara Stillman from the Johnson County League of Women Voters. Welcome to Let's Talk Issues, a public service program sponsored by the Johnson County Community College, the Kansas City Star, and the League of Women Voters. Tonight's subject is a wrap-up of the Kansas Legislature. Jim Sullinger from the Kansas City Star will be the moderator and introduce our panelists. Thank you for joining us, and now let's talk issues.
Good evening and welcome to Let's Talk Issues. Tonight we're going to focus on the legislative session. About several days ago, the legislature reached what it called its first adjournment. It's sort of a 2 to 3 week break in which legislators kind of figure out what the folks back home would like them to do, and then they come back at the end of the month, end of April, to do what's called a veto or wrap-up session. So we've already gotten most of the session out of the way, and we'd like to talk tonight about the accomplishments and especially about some of the daunting challenges that the legislature has faced, especially with the budget deficits and budget shortfalls that lawmakers have had to cope with. Our guests tonight are Senator Karen Brownley. She is Vice Chairman of the Senate's Financial Institutions Committee. Next to her is State Representative Kevin Yoder of Overland Park. Representative Yoder is the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, which deals with the budget. Representative Jean Reardon is next to Representative Yoder. Representative Reardon is from Overland Park and is a Democrat. The Republican sitting next to him is Representative Arlen Siegfried from Olathe, who is chairman of what obscure committee was he?
I'm the Speaker Pro Tem.
Oh, that's good point.
So I'm
Speaker Pro Tem. Very good.
Chairman of the Interstate Relations Committee,
okay.
Which meets
once every 7 years.
Whenever necessary. Let's put it.
Okay, very good. Well, I want to start off with a discussion of the budget. There's been a lot of news over the last 3 months about the budget situation, the problem of having to fill something like a $680 million hole. Kevin, you have been intimately involved in this budgetary process. How has it gone? What was the challenge coming in, and how have you overcome that challenge so far?
Well, the challenge coming in was a challenge that everyone's facing across the country, which is we have less revenue. People are losing their jobs. We know Sprint laid off people here locally. We know the unemployment rate's going up across the country. I think the latest federal number was 8.5%. As people lose their jobs, as corporations slow down their growth, we receive less revenue at the state. And twice a year, in November and April, we get what we call consensus revenue estimates. And those are estimates by our forecasters in Topeka that tell us how much money we can expect to have the next year. In November, when they met, they told us that we were in for a real shock when we came back in January, that potentially in the next year's budget we might have to make $1 billion worth of reductions over the 2 years. So the first thing we had to do when we came back in January is make reductions to the current year budget. Kansas, like most states, budgets based upon forecasted revenue. It's not revenue we start the year with and then spend down. So when we leave the session at the end of the year, we put together a budget for the next fiscal year, and our fiscal years run July 1 to June 30th.
Again, based on estimates.
That's right, based on estimates. So when we came back in January, we realized that our estimates were off and that we were actually going to have a shortfall for the current year. So the first thing we had to do is make reductions across the board to every state agency in the current fiscal year that ends in June, and those reductions came to corrections and our public safety, our social service areas, and we even had to try to do a little bit of reduction in the education area.
$33 a student, I think about 25 million. Or?
That was a reduction that happened in the first part of the session. That was the governor's reduction. Right. She had actually vetoed a portion of the bill that dealt with education, so she did her own cut to education. 4.25% across the board for every agency except for education and except for human service caseloads. Those are big cuts to deal with in the middle of the year. If you're a public safety area, if you're social services, to deal with 4.25%. That bill passed the House and Senate. The governor signed it by making some vetoes. The next thing we then did, and sort of a long answer to your question, is we started working on the FY 2010, fiscal year 2010 budget. And that's the work we just completed. We made reductions to every area of the budget. Our principles going into this included trying to get the budget into the black so that Kansans knew that their state government was spending less money than it had on hand as opposed to more money, which we can't do pursuant to our Constitution.
You didn't start out with much of an ending balance. I mean, the last 3 years, you basically spent down what would have been $1 billion ending balance, and in 3 years, it's sort of gone.
And others may want to speak to this. Yeah, we've spent more money than we've brought in every year for the last few years, and we've been saved by the fact that the economy grew. Right. But we estimated every year that we were going to spend more than we were bringing in. I think last year we ended up, $400 million more than we brought in. I mean, you can't sustain that on a year-to-year basis.
And this is a Republican-dominated legislature, correct?
It's a bipartisan legislature. We have a Democratic governor. She starts the ball rolling with the budget, and then we go through and spruce and try to prune that budget to bring it into compliance with state law. The budget that we were given this year by the governor, for example, had a $600,000 ending balance. Now, pursuant to state law, we're required to have a 7.5% ending balance. I mean,
very small.
That's less than 1/10% ending balance. That's no margin of error. So we had to go in and make more cuts than the governor made because we felt it was our fiduciary responsibility to put the budget in the black.
Okay. And what about what's everybody else's reaction to the budget? Is everybody happy with the budget? Did you all vote for it?
I was not happy with it. I think underlying this whole process is really a debate about the philosophy underlying government spending, etc. Because of our balanced budget amendment, which is ordinarily a good thing, Kansas, along with I think about 37 other states, is required to balance their budget and kind of really think like Herbert Hoover did back in the 30s. The federal government is obviously doing exactly the opposite of that. Most modern economic thinking is that when private spending is reduced, like it is now with our consumer spending down and our lending down from our banking system and people unable to get credit, the government has to step in with public spending to fill that gap. And that's what the federal government is doing. And that's why I think it's so important that Kansas does not cut more than it has to, which will make the situation worse rather than better and will actually work against the federal government stimulus plan. So that's why I think it's so important.
Yeah, but didn't Kansas get about $1 billion in federal stimulus money? I mean, it seemed like they got quite a lot. And how important was that in enabling you to not have to cut as deep as you probably wound up doing?
Well, the problem with the stimulus money was the federal government gave us things that we may not have wanted. For example, they gave us $55 million for weatherization. The most we'd ever had in that category was $11 million, which is this current fiscal year. Last year we had $2 million. So we have goofy things like that where the feds gave us money that we wouldn't have spent it there. One thing that exacerbated our problem was what we were talking about. When we overspent the past 2 years, $400 million more than we knew we would bring in both years. So in a 3-year time frame, we will have gone from nearly $1 billion excess to about $1 billion shortfall. So it's a $2 billion swing on a $6 billion budget.
But it could be pointed out that during those, 3 years or so of spending that down, the legislature did some tax cutting and a lot of extra spending on schools,
Exactly.
orchestrated to some degree, if I recall, by the Supreme Court.
Yes.
I've always said, and disagree with me if you want to, but I've always said that there are two things. I've mentioned this to you, Arlen, on the phone. Two things legislators like to do. They like to make their constituents happy by spending more money on schools and this and that, and they like to cut taxes. And if they've got a year where they can do both, it's heaven. This year, you haven't been able to do any of that.
I would, if I can address that a little, I have a little different opinion than Gene has, and I'll try to bring this back around to your comments. when I entered and when I ran for the House of Representatives, I very clearly ran on the basis of the fact that we needed to spend more money in education in certain areas and that we needed to make Kansas a better place to put a business. We have designed our tax cuts so that they do not tax capital, because we want to bring capital into this state, because what brings higher wages is productivity growth, which contributes to the gross state product, and inevitably when that happens you have higher wages. It has been proved time and time and time again over the last 60 years.
For example, you cut the machinery and equipment property tax.
That's
Or
absolutely
new equipment and machinery,
and-
about when, 3 years ago or so?
Yes, and the franchise tax
Right.
on businesses.
Right.
And these things were designed to make Kansas a better place to live. And we actually were making progress. For the first time in many years, the average income growth in the United States, Kansas has always been below that. We actually, 2 years ago, exceeded that. Now, we've probably been thrown off the path by what's been going on.
I was going to say, are we better off today because of that?
Nationally. Frankly, to some extent, we are better off today. Now, Kansas is not yet, according to national measures, a great place to put a business. We're about in the middle of the pack. It's very difficult to go any farther with that at this point in time.
Well, but you did. The House did.
Well, the House
you pass a
23
bill.
2365
Yes.
doesn't cost the state anything, and
Well-
that's what I maintain. There is a fiscal note, but if 2365 works, you bring in jobs, and you have a multiplication factor of at least 1.7%. That means at the very minimum, for every job you bring in, you create 7/10 of another job. And that brings in a lot of other taxes, sales taxes, mortgage taxes, property taxes. In fact, we would maintain, if you don't look at the static note that we get from the Department of Revenue, if they bring in the jobs the Department of Revenue projected, it's actually a $13 million positive to the state.
And what we're talking about, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not familiar with the bill numbers, is a bill that would allow a business that established new jobs to take the state withholding tax from those new jobs and keep it to grow the business, correct? Am I correct? on that?
That's
Period of time.
yeah.
Yes.
It's not.
So why
permanent.
doesn't, so what you're saying is that while the state would maybe lose money in terms of the withholding tax, they would gain it from the new jobs and property tax
How
and
can
other
you
kinds
lose
of
money
taxes.
you never had, Jim?
Oh, okay.
These are brand new jobs. How can you lose money you never had? That's the point we're trying to make.
Okay.
And we're trying to do intelligent things to make Kansas, to bring business into Kansas and to bring new innovation into Kansas. Kansas has a great manufacturing sector. You think of us as an agricultural state, but actually more state revenue comes from manufacturing than comes from agricultural in this state. So,
Before we leave the budget, can I say
Oh,
something?
we're going to be on the
Okay,
budget for
all right.
another 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say something about education, because there's been a lot, education, as you know,
Been a lot written about
is the
education
major
reductions
portion
Right.
of the state budget.
and a lot of fear on the part of school districts that they were going to be cut by as much as $300 a student, for example.
Right.
That was a scare at the beginning of the session, if you remember.
And on the stimulus package, I believe there's $383 million at stake
Right.
in the federal stimulus package for education. And I say at stake because to get that $383 million, we require a maintenance of effort. And that is, there's some dispute about what is
that's all being
effective
hashed out.
maintenance of effort. But one thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that a lot has been made of the percentage cut of education being minimal compared to some of the other state agencies. And I think if you look at percentages, you are getting a misleading picture of what actually has been cut. Because if you look at not only the $33 in the 2010 per student based state aid per pupil, the $33 in 2009, the $59 which we had promised last year, you come up with $125 base state aid cut. If you add in the cost of living, the 3.7% cost of living, which was scheduled, and the special education funding cuts, which are about 1% in each of the years, you're up close to $200 million, $190 million or so. I added it up today. So I think it's misleading to say that this $33 is the only thing cut. In other words, education has taken a major cut, and I think it's important to point that out.
I'm sure you want to say something, Senator?
Well, from what I can understand, you are describing that they are not going to get the increases that they had hoped to get. And no one's getting increases. Okay.
Yeah.
But as far as cuts go, I think percentages do communicate because over the 2 years, K through 12 will have a 1.5% cut. The regents are getting more than a 7% cut over those same 2 years.
Right. Which is
So-
actually impacting the community college here.
It has to.
Yeah.
It's significant.
For example, if Bill Gates and I each get, if he gets a 1% cut and I get a 50% cut, and then you say, well, our top priority is Gene Raridan getting 50% cut, it's misleading.
Well, I can tell you, I talk to a lot of school administrators and school folks, and while they don't like to be cut, I noticed a sigh of relief when the bill was finally passed with the amount that was in it, because I think they had expected a lot worse, and I think there was a bit of a sigh of relief when it wasn't as bad as they had thought that was going to be. So that's what I'm hearing from school folks.
I'd like to make one more statement, and I'd like to throw out a compliment to my colleague here,
Which one?
Kevin, because
I thought maybe it was Gene.
well,
I was going to tell you too.
I compliment Gene. He looks extremely nice on the camera. But Kevin was dropped into an absolute maelstrom in this budget thing, and has done a tremendous job.
Well,
And
never
he's-
before have we had these kind of figures, these kind of reductions to have to work with.
It's historic. And,
It's historic.
And he's handled it well, and so far he has kept the harm to public education at an absolute minimum. Now, nobody can say anything about the future. I just want to point out that the Kansas School for the Deaf and the Kansas School for the Blind are also education and special education. And they're taking a 4.3% cut and probably will be over 6%, maybe 8% before this thing's done. But apparently there is no constitutional mandate that we educate those folks, and so we go ahead and treat them as an agency and we cut them. The real problem is, and Kevin and I have had this discussion, is we have a foundational problem in the state of Kansas that we have overspent our money for at least 5 years in a row. We are going to make some rather large cuts here, but it appears, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, we will still spend more than we bring in the coming year. It is an extremely difficult problem, which has been somewhat muddied by the stimulus money, because the stimulus is coming in and moderating that to some extent. But in 2012, unless this economy snaps back rather quickly in the state of Kansas, we're going to face the same cliff all over again, and probably without stimulus money.
I heard this from a number of school boards and city councils and the county government. You know, I've been looking at ending balances for local governments. And there's some local governments, school boards, school districts that have some pretty healthy ending balances. And the community college, for example, very healthy ending balance. The county government, very large ending balance, which they'll be able to draw down on when they get the cuts that they're making. So there will, some of the pain in terms of local government will be eased somewhat by some pretty good ending balances. But they made the same point numerous times that Arlen just made, which is the stimulus money goes for 2 years. What happens if we aren't recovered in 2 years? And so they're not going to spend all those reserves. And they're not going to spend the reserves because they're worried about 2 years from now that they might need those reserves just to keep from falling off that cliff that Arlen was talking about.
And Jim, that brings us back to the state of Kansas in that we're looking at our local units of government, they have ending balances. We're looking at our school districts, they have ending balances. We look at the state of Kansas, it has no contingency reserve account. Right. We are not being good fiscal stewards of our finances, and I think that's what hopefully the consensus is in the legislature, that we have to be better fiscal stewards. We have to have the state in the black. We can't spend more money than we bring in. And I was interested, Representative Raritan spoke about the distinction between the federal government and the state of Kansas. I think that's a healthy conversation to have. I think most Kansans would believe that when you're in a hole, you stop digging. Most of us would believe when times get tough that they expect government to live within its means.
And tighten the belt.
And tighten the belt.
Yeah.
And federal government.
But I understand
That's a perfect
I understand.
example of the,
right. I understand
what I
why
call
Representative Reardon is talking
Herbert
about.
The Herbert Hoover type of thinking, unfortunately. And I feel.
But the federal government is pumping in tremendous amounts of money, billions and trillions of dollars into the economy.
Mark Zandi, who was an advisor to Senator McCain in his presidential contest, has put together a chart of bang for the buck in terms of spending and its effect, its multiplier effect. And some of the most important multipliers are infrastructure spending, unemployment insurance payments, which the federal government is helping the state of Kansas out, and food stamps. So those are something that's very important to consider when we consider, how are we going to get our economy back on track?
But by
we're
law,
going to need to. Right. Yes, right.
But by law,
we are forced to think like Herbert
right.
Hoover a little
by
bit.
By law, Kansas cannot do what Obama is doing.
And that's why Obama and the federal government is making the stimulus money available to replace some of the funds that Kansas
And Kansas
has to
is not
out.
going to rescue the national economy.
Jim, if we go back to what Kansas has been doing the last 10 to 15 years, we have increased our state debt the second fastest of any state in the country. We were once a pillar of our fiscal management. We were 50th out of 50 states in terms of debt per capita. We've now shot to the middle of that pack. The federal government continues to borrow and spend. I think at some point, those of us who are in positions of influence in government need to be concerned about who's going to pay these bills. Who is going to pay off all of this debt that continues to be racked up? At some point, our children, our grandchildren, Kansans who aren't even born yet are being saddled with debt for expenses that we are spending now. At some point, we have to live within our means. And that's the real challenge. So in good times, we borrowed and spent. In bad times, we borrow and spend. And the challenge is this isn't anything new.
Yeah. Well, in good times, you also cut taxes.
Yes, exactly. And over the past 5 years at the federal level, our debt has increased $5 trillion. Right. So I think we don't need to, the idea is when times are good, that's when we balance the budget.
Or maybe build up a nice big contingency fund.
When they're bad, it's just the opposite, exactly. Right.
We have to acknowledge that this president's deficit is going to be, you add the deficits from Washington to Bush the second together, you add all those together, and his deficit is going to be greater than that. It's humongous. And so as a fiscal conservative, one thing I've asked is it even a principled position to accept this stimulus money, a budget hole today in an economy that does not recover in 2 years becomes a budget crater? Because we're not going to get this money again.
And where all this is leading is massive tax increases.
Exactly.
And if that's the sort of stimulus that we're talking about, then that's where we're headed. And I personally think that Kansans in particular were a very conservative state in terms of fiscal conservatism. We believe that people ought to live within their means, that when you're in a hole, you stop digging. What we're trying to do in Kansas is get our fiscal ship in order. This is a symptomatic problem all across the country. We all borrow and spend. We don't know how to say no. We as government leaders ought to lead by example in this effort. And I know there are legislators in Topeka that have never seen an amendment that they could turn down. Every amendment comes on the floor, the money goes in, and when the budget comes around and it's time to vote for the budget, they vote against it. We load this thing up, and then we let the folks that have to run the legislature try to solve this problem. This is how the budget always grows. This thing never shrinks. As the session goes on, more spending priorities. And think about
So
it.
what do you do about it? I mean, there has been some suggestion that you start the budget process way before January.
Well, when we pass legislation, to request that the governor's budget, and the governor's budget is what starts this process.
That's right.
That comes to us in December, so we could spend more time with it. But the inherent problem is not timing necessarily. It's our ability as legislators to say no and to uphold our constitutional duty to our constituents, which is when we go to Topeka, we're not going to spend more money than we have. Yeah. And that's really the fundamental challenge, and I think we're trying to get to.
Well, I would like to leave the budget and go to a few other things that have been done.
More to say about
In fact,
the budget,
yes,
though,
we
Jim.
I'd like to, well, we could spend probably the whole hour on the
Yes,
budget,
we
but
could.
I want to go through a little more of the list of accomplishments and a list of things that haven't quite been accomplished yet. But things that have gotten some publicity here on TV, in the newspaper, and I think we ought to bring folks up to date on where these things are. For example, the statewide smoking ban passed the Senate, I think twice, if I recall, but it seems to have hit a bit of a problem in the House of Representatives. And I'm wondering too, and I want to throw this out, why do we need it when in Johnson County almost every city has passed it?
Well,
Or are we talking about going to Ulysses and smoking, or getting secondhand smoke? Johnson County, I don't know that it's that big of an issue because every city has passed no smoking ordinances. So where is it?
it is right at the moment. It is in committee officially, but I don't think you'll see it again this session.
Okay.
Yeah, it was supposed to, we heard, it was going to be brought up the last day, but I think they did not bring it up because they didn't feel they had the votes to pass
Do
it.
any of you think we need a statewide smoking ban?
I would support it.
You would support
yes,
it?
I would support it. My wife has lung cancer, and in addition to, not that she's never been a smoker, so it
Secondhand?
wasn't due to that. Well, it probably wasn't
Maybe.
even due to secondhand, it was something else. But I know how bad the disease is, how terrible it is, and I think anything we can do in that area would be good. In addition, what they found is that smoking bans affect heart attack rates almost immediately, much more quickly than they do lung diseases. So
Anybody against it?
I think it's important.
Okay. State your case.
I'm also on the Health and Human Services Committee where this came through. And I believe that when the Supreme Court said this could be handled at a local level, which they have ruled, the Kansas Supreme Court, that local governments have the authority to do these smoking bans. And they are doing them. Johnson County is almost totally smoke-free, and it is spreading out across the state. And I think that all but a few small counties, it will be smoke-free, in a few years. However, this particular bill, had it come through with no exceptions, would have been difficult to stop. But it came through with
It has
exceptions that were very difficult to deal with, such as you can't have smoking in a local business, but you can have smoking on the casino floor. The government makes money off the casinos, but private businesses couldn't make money off smoking.
Right.
You can have a smoking exception for adult care centers and long-term care centers by creating a separate room with separate ventilation, but that was unacceptable for a bar or a restaurant to have a separate room and separate ventilation. We had studies saying that no amount of secondhand smoke was safe, but yet they allowed secondhand smoking in 20% of the motel rooms, although the same study said that no wall or ventilation would prevent secondhand smoking particulates from spreading. It's absolutely totally inconsistent in the exceptions, and in the end, I think the House as a whole, or at least the majority, felt like it didn't make sense in its present form. And then the other issue is do we actually need it, or can it be handled on a local basis?
A couple of years ago, well, let me preface this next subject by saying that over the last 8 years, the number of farm wineries in Kansas has exploded. There are a lot of them out there, and new ones coming on all the time. So 2 or 3 years ago, a law was passed that if you wanted a case of wine from a local farm winery, you could order it by mail, but it had to come to your local liquor store, and then you had to go pick it up there. This year, the legislature made a change in that, and Senator Brownlee, you had something to do with that. Why don't you describe what's been done?
Well, actually, I didn't have anything to do with it this year, except that I supported it. But a few years ago, when we tried to pass it, I carried the banner for it at that time, which was rather unique as a non-drinker to do that. But you could just see where the free market issues were really being suppressed. Why in the world would someone have to go pick up something they've ordered from their local retail liquor store? I mean, I don't call Eddie Bauer and order something and then go to Oak Park Mall and pick it up. It was just really goofy. And so I'm glad that we've seen the light. But the problem,
so it will come to your house now.
Correct.
Under this
but
law.
There are limits as to how much you can order and so forth. So at least we've finally gone the right direction.
Okay.
Would you like to speak to Goofy about this?
Okay.
Because I'm Goofy.
Okay.
I'm the one
I
that put
agree
that
with
provision in there.
Yeah, really.
And the reason is for identification purposes. Let me tell you what we've done in 212. You know, we have never relied on online age verification in the state of Kansas, and we do that in 212. Now we've lowered the standard for wine identification. Are we going to lower it for other kinds of alcohol? Are we going to lower it for cigarettes? Are we going to lower it for firearms and use online identification for that? I can guarantee you, I'm the father of 5 children. Your kids can have your ID out of your wife's purse and go order something and have it back in her purse before the television show gets over with by a long shot.
I take it you voted against the bill.
I voted against the bill. I stood up and talked against the bill. We also put in so UPS and FedEx would deliver these things that the driver can do physical identification. Well, you're looking at a guy who was never carded after he was 16 years old. Well, now we're going to say that a UPS or a FedEx driver can go to the door and say, well, you look like you're old enough. Here's your case of wine. Now, Jim, that is irresponsible. Are we going to do that with firearms? Or are we going to do that?
I don't think it's gone that far.
No, because when I did the research on this about 3 years ago, these shippers are already doing this, and they have a great deal of liability on the line. It works. And so I would disagree. And the tax situation, that was another thing, is how do we collect the taxes? These wineries would not be allowed to sell in Kansas if they didn't send in their taxes. All these issues have already been taken care of.
They have not been taken care of because I spoke directly to the people. This bill came out of Fed and State, and the chair of Fed and State voted against the bill for the same reasons. It came out of his committee because he had a hearing and it got voted out. However, the UPS drivers and the FedEx drivers have said they will not stop and get a picture ID. They will only do a physical identification.
I can only
and
tell
this,
you.
this is going to cause us problems in the future. The reason it went to a liquor store was so that, because the liquor store driver would ask for a picture ID and would purposely identify who it was. You will not deliver any other kind of alcohol to the door, but you will turn wine loose at the door. I'm not against wine or wine shippers, although I don't drink it myself, but this is an unworkable plan, and my fear is that alcohol will fall into the hands of minors and you'll have tragedies.
Well, I am a connoisseur of Kansas wine. I like Kansas wine, and I like the fact that I can order it now and it'll come to my house, and believe me, nobody underage will be drinking it at my house.
And you should tell the governor that you like Kansas wine.
Oh, that's right, I forgot.
Right,
She
she's not a
prefers
fan of
Washington
Kansas.
State wine, if I recall. Let's go to another issue, and I think an important one, because if you remember, in 1998, 3 young 15-year-old girls were killed on their way to a softball game in the Blue Valley area. It sparked at that time an effort to raise the age for teenage drivers. It's been a long process. That was 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago. This session, you all finally passed that. Is there somebody here that can kind of just very quickly explain what that bill does and how it's going to impact teen drivers?
Well, I can talk to it a little bit because I'm on the Transportation Committee, so we have been dealing with this the last couple of years, and I think actually longer than that on subcommittees. But one of the things that I have seen in newspaper reports that I think are misleading is that you have to be 17 years old to get a full unrestricted license. That isn't true. As long as you follow some of the earlier requirements, you would be able to have an unrestricted license at the age of 16 and a half.
Oh,
16 and a
16
half.
okay.
You would have to do that. You would also,
As long as you followed the rules.
yeah,
along-
with
in previous
requiring I think 50 hours
Hours, yeah.
of supervision, 10 hours at night, things like that. You will not be allowed to talk on a cell phone, you know,
And
while
there's
you're
some
driving.
restrictions on the passengers in the,
The
car. that you can
passengers.
Only
have.
one non-sibling passenger
non-siblings.
can't drive after 9 p.m.
Yeah.
And then at age 17,
or before
those,
5 a.m., right.
those things are.
And the reason was that you know, these new drivers, these new teenage drivers, kill themselves at a rate far greater than in any other age group.
The estimates are 20 to 30% reduction in accidents in states that have these types of
And I should point
programs.
out that Missouri has this too. Missouri passed this several years ago, so we're keeping up with Missouri on that.
Well, I think it's an excellent bill. I voted for it because I think we've known for several years, and there was a magazine I read, statistics, that when you have the teenagers that have peers in the car, the accident rate
It
goes
goes up.
up phenomenally.
Yes.
And
Especially driving at night, late at night too, the statistics are horrendous. Well, I consider that, frankly, because I've covered that issue for a number of years, and I consider it a major accomplishment of the legislature this year. Coal plant. It seems like every 3 days last year we were writing stories about efforts to put these coal plants in western Kansas. I understand that's ongoing this year as well, although it's frankly not getting the same kind of publicity as the budget is, for example. But what's happening with the coal plant efforts at this point? Is there somebody that can address that?
Well, the bill's passed both chambers. It's on its way to the governor at this time. And so I think some of the questions we've had as legislators are, who is the governor that will sign it or not sign it or veto it? And if it is the new governor, the current lieutenant governor, how would he respond? So
And if he-
that's the big if.
Right. And if he vetoes it, can it be overridden?
in the Senate it can be.
In the Senate, there's no...
The House is a huge question.
Yeah.
The House, yeah, in the vote that we took last week was quite a bit short of the required 84. However, there were several people that did not vote who probably will vote for it, and a few others that voted against it that probably will change their vote. So it'll be a close vote if the veto does happen, and if we are asked to override the veto.
One of the surprises, I think, in this session was the abortion bill that the governor signed. She doesn't sign many of those, especially the abortion bills that are have restrictions on them that are supported by the pro-life folks. Usually meet with her veto. This was a bill, if I recall, that does it require a fetal sonogram, or is it a choice that the woman can make? I'm not that familiar with the bill.
If they have that equipment, if the person has that equipment, they're required.
Then they're
to
required to show a
It's
fetal
offered.
sonogram.
Make it
It's
offered.
offered.
They're not required. Yeah, they're not required to show it. They're required to offer,
offer
the woman an opportunity to look at one if she so chooses.
Okay.
And it's our understanding that a lot of entities already do this.
Okay.
That it wasn't a major new restriction that Planned Parenthood and other agencies had this as one of the things they could offer, and this just, I think, just says that they have to offer women the opportunity.
But I also heard that one reason she might have signed it was because it got such overwhelming support that if she'd vetoed it, there's a good chance it would have been overturned.
I think that's very
You agree?
possible.
It was a powerful vote in both houses. Yeah.
Well, she was looking at the possibility of having her veto overturned, and so why not sign it?
Right. And it's just not that dramatic of a law. I think it's a very important step. But to offer a sonogram versus mandating a sonogram, that's why I say it's not dramatic. Very important, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Kansans for Life folks that I know were very happy that she signed that bill.
And this isn't the first pro-life bill that the governor has signed over her tenure. She has signed other bills, and it's always been sort of surprising. The governor presents herself as very strongly pro-choice, yet she does sign bills, and it's sort of interesting because she has signed bills that Planned Parenthood has opposed. So sometimes it's hard to predict where she'll end up on an abortion bill.
Well, what about the bill, and I think there's another one.
One thing about, okay, maybe you're going to speak to that, but one thing I should say
one on reporting
is that
requirements,
there has been a reduction in abortions over the last 7 years in Kansas, I think about 12.5%, which is in excess of the national decline, which I think is a good thing. The governor is a strong supporter of adoption incentives, comprehensive health care for expectant mothers, and also education, sex education primarily, but with opt-out provisions, I think. And those kinds of things, I think, are the kinds of things we should utilize and to help reduce abortions.
What about the bill that increases reporting requirements for late-term abortions? I understand that's somewhere in the process.
That passed the Senate Friday, and the Senate was
218.
So it's passed both chambers. It would be on its way to the governor. But, Gene, in response to what you're saying, late-term abortions have increased by 10% in Kansas. So that's why some of these measures are very important. That's why Senate Bill 218 that just passed, that you referenced, is important, so that we have a clear medical diagnosis why a late-term abortion is being done, because that's not being done.
Right.
KDHE just hasn't followed the law in
Will
that
she
regard.
sign that, or
I doubt it.
Lieutenant,
doubt it.
or Lieutenant Governor
was-
Parkinson when he becomes governor sign
It
it?
was right on the borderline of being veto sustained.
Each house.
I predict she'll sign it. I think she will. I think the process she's in right now, I think the governor is not wanting to create any friction, particularly with
pro-life
highly
community.
charged political issues like that, and I think she'll sign them.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens.
I
Could I
think one of the things on that bill that's kind of disturbing to me is the change in the definition of viability.
Well, it makes it consistent
Because-
throughout the statute, Gene.
Well,
That's
it
why
may
it's
be
important
consistent,
to
but
do it.
what it does is extend it extends viability to include artificial means outside of the womb. So basically, if a baby or a fetus can be sustained with artificial means, which is different than the way it reads now in terms of viability, they would be counted as viable. So that would, in effect, extend the late-term abortion rulings and things like that. So it does make a pretty significant change.
But Gene, any unborn child at 22 plus weeks has extensive equipment to keep them alive, extensive measures. And so that it only makes sense.
I think the courts
They require
is common or normal medical technology available at this time, and
Yes.
clearly the medical technology gets better and better at all
Just as
times.
artificial.
According
or
to accepted
means.
obstetrical and neonatal standards of care and practice applied by physicians in the same or similar circumstances.
It does several other things, though. It includes the parts of CARA from last year, such as civil remedies for illegal late-term abortions. It changes the law to match the federal law, where it just mentions the physical life of the mother, or mentions the life of the mother. It doesn't mention the other aspects. It says that for a misdemeanor, the doctor can have his license pulled, where now I think it says a felony. And also it has in it parts of a South Dakota law that's already been gone through the federal appeals process, where it describes the baby as a separate life. And it also would say that now there's a brochure on fetal development. In the future, they would have to, if asked, provide a video on fetal development. So there are some pretty extensive things in there.
I'd like to go back to alcohol, but instead of wine, let's talk about beer. A bill that got a lot of publicity, especially on television, and was of great interest to some of my drinking buddies, was the idea that you could buy full-strength beer in grocery stores or service stations. What happened? What's the possibility that my friends can go into the grocery store and buy full-strength beer instead of the 3-2 malt beverage?
Well, that did not pass, and
You mean they're going to be disappointed?
yeah.
It was about 123.
It was a floor amendment. It was a floor amendment by a local representative on another bill,
Well,
and it did not. It was not
Part of
received
the
well.
reasoning fits in with Arlen's argument against wine, and that is that the convenience stores, grocery stores, are not equipped to properly
do the
ID
ID.
people. So there is a good point there. Another thing that I heard, and I never did verify it, is that liquor stores are not able to get cash purchase discounts, and that the big store chains would be able to do that. And also, there's something about buying on credit versus paying cash, and that was another significant factor, I think, that ensured its defeat.
So all you beer drinkers, no beer in the grocery store.
Well, you can't
Or at
buy
least
beer.
the full-strength beer in the grocery store. You have to go to your liquor store for that.
Jim, I would say this. I don't think the issue is the difference between 3.2 beer and 5% beer. It is, those are not absolute distinctions. They just say it is not over. And sometimes those beers are actually within less than 1% of each other.
Okay.
There's a lot of the three-tiered law that we have here in Kansas. People hold on to their part of that very jealously. And what I think a lot of liquor stores and other people are afraid of is having grocery stores become like Missouri, where you can go in and buy anything.
Yeah.
And I don't think, right at the moment, the Kansas legislature, at least the House, is not ready to consider that real seriously.
The veto session is ahead of us, and I want to talk a little bit before the program ends on what you see coming in that. But I want to get your views, though, first on something that has cropped up in numerous news stories, and that is some criticism of the governor for a lack of focus this session, especially with her moving on to the job of Health Secretary in the Obama administration. Health and Human Services, I think, is the agency. Do you think the governor lacked focus this year, and have you heard that complaint? And what do you expect much of a change under a Parkinson administration, Mark Parkinson administration, the lieutenant governor who will take over when the governor resigns? Just want to get your thoughts.
First of all, I would say, frankly, and the other folks can talk about it, but when I'm in session, I have a job to do, and I'm so focused on my job, I'm not out here evaluating whether the governor's focused on her job or not, because the governor and I do not interact except on very
rare occasions.
Very rare occasions.
Page
Pictures.
And I'm busy doing other things, and the governor has her responsibilities. I have mine, and if I do mine correctly, I don't have a lot of time to sit around and think about what the governor's doing. And as far as Lieutenant Governor Parkinson, each of the governor and Mark each have their own personality, and the only thing I can say is I probably know Mark better than I do Governor Sebelius.
Well, he was once a Republican
from
Olathe.
But how he will react, I do not expect his policies to be markedly different than Governor Sebelius's.
Representative Reardon, do you think that the criticism of the governor lacking focus was misplaced?
Yes, any criticism that I haven't really heard too much of that, but
It's been out there.
I think that when she has needed to be involved, for example, on the budget issues, I think she's been there, and I think she's done a good job on that. And I don't see, again, like Representative Siegfried, I don't see a lot of difference between her positions and the incoming Lieutenant Governor.
Any thoughts by you all?
I mean, I would concur with Representative Siegfried's comments. It's probably not a productive exercise for us to spend our time judging or criticizing the governor. I think we're all Happy that a Kansan is being nominated for a cabinet post, and we're all, I think, happy that someone who's a Kansas governor who's doing that. I will say, though, in some challenge to comments Representative Reardon's discussing, in terms of the budget, we've not been engaged by her on any of the budget issues. We wanted to be. We've tried to work with her officials, but in terms of actually having the governor sit down with us and say, how do we get out of this fiscal crisis? I've offered some ideas. What are your ideas? How can we get this done? It has essentially been the state of the state. Here are the governor's ideas, and that's been it. And that's not something we're complaining about. It's just a reality of the challenge we're facing as we try to come up with a budget that fits the priorities of both Democrat and Republican caucuses.
And I think that's the comments that I had read about when I have read about lack of focus. Senator Brownlee, you
I'll
thoughts
comment
on that?
On Lieutenant Governor Parkinson. He was my predecessor. He was in the Senate seat before I was elected. And so I've known him about 18 years, would appreciate working with him. My guess is that he might be less strident than Governor Sebelius, coming from the Republican background, coming from the position of being a businessman. I think that'll be very helpful to him and helpful to Kansans as he takes on that role.
Well, and I will concur with that. We've met with him twice, actually, in the past few weeks over the budget. We've gone over the numbers with him. You know, we're trying to get a dialogue started with him, and he's expressed willingness to really engage, roll up his sleeves and get engaged with us on the budget. He says he's not running for re-election. That puts him in a great position to really help us do the right thing and to make. These are not easy decisions we're making.
Next session may not be an easy one either. It's
not going to be. And these types of decisions are not easy on anyone, and it gets at least less challenging if we have full governor participation in our decisions.
Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about the veto session that's coming up. I talked recently with Senator Wysong of Mission Hills, who is a member of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. He indicated that he thought that when the budget experts met in another week or so to give you new revenue estimates, that those revenue estimates could be down at least another $200 million, maybe more, and that when you return for the veto session, you may have to cut some more. How much we'll know in another week. What are your thoughts on the upcoming veto session? What do you see happening in it? Any predictions? Let's start with you, Senator Brownlee.
Okay, first of all, I just want to ask Representative Yoder what abortion bills the governor has signed previously. But if you want to talk about it off the air, that'd be fine. I just don't recall.
Yeah, I'd like to. We got 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll have to go
I want to
quick,
talk about the
but
veto session for about 5 minutes.
I thought she had signed a bill previously, or a bill or two.
I don't think so. So that's why I wanted to bring
Okay,
that
sure.
up.
We'll make a
appreciate
correction
that.
then.
Okay.
Start on the veto session.
Okay, veto session. My best guess, we probably need to cut about $200 million more from the budget. I think K through 12 will have to absorb some of that. And when you think about it, K through 12 has 4 sources of local money that other agencies don't have. SRS cannot build a building, for example, without asking our permission. Schools can do that. They've got their foundations, they've got the local option budget, they've got their capital outlay. So they have a number of sources of local revenue.
Plus, some of them have a nice surplus.
Exactly. Other state agencies are not in that position. I think that will be a focus, and certainly if there is a veto of the coal plant bill, getting the votes to override that veto, and who knows what kind of arm twisting might occur.
Right. Representative Yoder, 4 minutes.
Well, as Chair of Appropriations, I mean, we're going to be spending all of our time working on the budget during the veto session, and it's going to involve every legislator. We're trying to get input from community members. We're trying to get input from people across the state, from legislators across the spectrum. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very challenging. What we're going to do, though, is do everything we can to put Kansas in a better fiscal position. If we're in a position where we have to cut $200 or $300 million, we're going to have to go in and cut $200 or $300 million. What we'd ask is that we have full participation on these difficult choices. There are legislators who are not going to vote for anything because it involves cuts to precious programs. All these programs are important.
Do you expect Governor Parkinson to be in the veto session?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think so. But the point of this big veto session is we're going to have to share in the burden, and we're asking all of our state agencies to help share because it's a community problem, it's a state problem, and every part of our budget has to be willing to sacrifice.
Okay.
One thing I
Representative
think
Reardon.
we need to emphasize again, we don't want to cut prematurely for the reasons I outlined. Taking money out of the economy will make things worse, not better. So we don't want to cut more than we have to. The other thing that no one has mentioned is the fact that there's $50 million in gaming fees that should be in the mix. And additionally, there are a couple of tax stoppages, decrease stoppages on the estate tax and the franchise tax that were mentioned and have not been brought up in our tax committee. $60 million.
Representative Siegfried.
I have said repeatedly that if it comes to the point you have to touch those tax decreases, which our businesses are counting on, that you do it in such a way differently than the governor did, that we must take action to establish to have those cuts be in effect every time. In other words, we structure them so that if next session we don't act, those cuts come right back into effect. The other thing I would say, and I say this, have to support Kevin here, if you're going to be part of this budget process, I see so many people that vote to add money to the budget and then vote against the budget, and I think that's fiscally irresponsible. Okay. I think it just makes the problem worse, and if you want to make that vote so you can please your people back home, I guess you have to do that. But I think at this point in time, we all need to bite the bullet and vote a responsible budget.
Well, and we need to wind this down. We only have a minute left. And in that minute, I want to thank Senator Karen Brownlee of Olathe, Republican, for being with us, Representative Kevin Yoder of Overland Park, a Republican, Representative Reardon, a Democrat, and Representative Arlen Siegfried, another Republican from Olathe. Thank you for being with us. The legislature obviously has a very difficult task ahead of it as it goes into its final wrap-up or veto session. So good luck to you all. It could be a very interesting week or 2 weeks. Surely not 3 weeks. Okay, very good. And thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Issues.